She had never asked where babies came from. In the small, sterile community of Hesper, questions were rationed like resources. Curiosity was not forbidden, but it was discouraged, especially the kind that spiraled inward. There were lessons, plentiful ones, on climate regulation, crop calibration, and neural interfacing. But human reproduction had long been filed under primitive knowledge, archived and concealed with the same care given to war history and combustion engines. The body was a tool, the mind is technician. Emotions, particularly the kind that might lead one to desire replication, were considered clutter, relics from before the reset. And yet she felt something, not a need, exactly, not desire, but a pulse of something ancient and soft pressing against the hardened edges of her logic. It arrived not as a question, but a sensation. Watching a pair of birds weaving their nest in a hydroponic dome, she noticed how one bird tucked itself beneath the wing of the other. Their movements were not efficient. They wasted time, nuzzling, pausing, and yet the nest grew, sturdy and complex, lined with strands of insulation peeled from the dome's edges. The image haunted her long after the birds had flown. Her name was Alice. She was 27, a systems ecologist ranked in the top 10 percentile of Hesper's analytic cohort. She had never been punished, never failed an audit. Her genetic architecture, like all of Hesper's citizens, had been optimized for low aggression, high adaptability, and sustained cognitive performance. She had passed her reproductive deferral at 17 with ease, no latent tendencies flagged, no risk of anomaly. And yet, it began with a text. She discovered them in the quiet, forgotten corners of the knowledge archive, scattered documents tagged as red-level curiosity, ancient anthropology. She wasn't looking for them, not at first. A search on comparative nesting strategies in engineered environments had yielded a misfiled subdocument, maternal symbolism in prairie-set societies. It should have been locked. It wasn't. Alice read it in silence, first with clinical detachment, then with something bordering on obsession. The words formed images. Mothers weeping over cradles, women painted in ochre with rounded bellies, the myth of Eve biting into knowledge. These were not metaphors to Alice. They were fragments of some deeper narrative, one that had been carefully sheared from the language of her world. That night, she lay awake in her sleep cradle, staring at the darkened ceiling of her pod. Her metrics blinked quietly above her. Oxygen normal, cortisol rising, REM absent. She imagined not a baby, not a child, but a second Alice, smaller, soft-skinned, blinking in confusion. Would she recognize herself? Would the second Alice remember first? Would she love her or merely obey her? She stopped eating for 2 days. It wasn't conscious protest, rather a kind of drowning. Her dreams became heavy with symbols, blood mixing with soil, a heartbeat pulsing through roots, voices echoing in tones she'd never heard in the corridors of Hesper. Her supervisor, unit directory men, called her in for a recalibration. "You're trending low in coherence," he said, scrolling through her metrics. "Your linguistic output has increased in complexity. Unusual metaphors, elevated pronoun frequency. These are signs of narrative fixation." "I'm not unwell," Alice replied. "I didn't say you were unwell. I said your pattern is irregular. What are you reading?" She paused, a single moment too long. "Environmental dynamics," she said finally. Remen nodded, but his eyes lingered. She left the chamber knowing her records were no longer private. Still, she returned to the text, dug deeper. Myths of creation and destruction. Biographies of prairie-set women who gave birth alone in fields, in shelters, in the dark. Stories of daughters who became mothers, who raised replicas of themselves not in code but in flesh. She wondered, was it compulsion or choice? Could she, born in a world of restraint and design, become something as unmeasured as a mother? And then came the girl. It was in the reflection chamber, a domed sanctuary meant for cognitive decompression. Alice entered alone, as she often did, but in the mirrored surface, she did not see herself. She saw a child, brown-eyed, spectral, standing just beyond the wall's curvature. The girl blinked, tilted her head. Alice turned to look behind her. Nothing. When she looked back, the mirror was blank. She told no one, not even the recorder embedded in her wristband. But from that day forward, she began to speak in second person internally. You will need shelter. You must eat. You must sleep. She began to construct not blueprints, but possibilities. Where would a second Alice live? Would she have the same voice? Would her laugh be programmed or spontaneous? Alice built a model embryo, not in secret. Her profession allowed her to work with genetic simulacra for ecosystem balance. But this one was unauthorized, unassigned. She called it S-Delta-1, a placeholder that meant nothing to anyone but her. The embryo was only theoretical, a sequence suspended in code. Yet she returned to it every evening, editing the lines, shifting traits. Curiosity high, memory enhanced, emotional bandwidth unrestricted. What is this project? Asked Riemann weeks later. He stood behind her at the terminal, voice tight. An experiment in behavioral unpredictability. Alice replied calmly. You've deviated from authorized sequencing bounds. No oversight. No submission. Do you know what this could be interpreted as? I'm exploring. Isn't that why we're here? Riemann leaned closer. Exploration must not destabilize function. She was reassigned the next morning. Her new role was agricultural monitoring. Hands in the soil, away from the code. She didn't mind. Something in the act of touch gave her clarity. Seeds could not lie. They only knew how to grow. The girl returned. This time not in glass, but in dream. She ran through a field of synthetic wheat, hair streaming, laughter echoing. When she turned, Alice saw her face clearly. It was hers, and it wasn't. Younger, freer, unmarked by the metrics. The girl reached for her, then dissolved into light. Alice woke with tears on her cheeks. She no longer questioned the possibility. She only questioned the method. There was no permission path for what she wanted. She had no partner, no designation, no sanctioned reproductive right. Yet she could not forget the sensation, the echo of that imagined touch, that imagined laugh, not for legacy, not for ego, but for continuity, for connection. She opened the code one final time. S-Delta-1 shimmered on the screen, flickering with latent algorithms. Alice spoke aloud. Do you want to be? The monitor pulsed once, not with an answer, but with readiness. Behind her, the morning lights brightened the pod's synthetic sky. Somewhere far above, the birds were nesting again. One feather floated past the air duct vent, unnoticed. Alice reached for the activation key. Alice didn't activate the embryo. Not immediately. She sat with the knowledge of it, like a stone held beneath the tongue, familiar yet heavy. The idea had passed from theory to proximity. It lived now in the liminal space between thought and act, between longing and consequence. She found herself whispering to the girl, not in dreams, but aloud, in the solitude of the fields. You're not real, but I feel you. The dirt responded better to silence than confessions. Rows of engineered wheat rustled in the artificial wind, swaying under a sky tuned to mimic late spring. The illusion of warmth could be calibrated, but the weight of uncertainty couldn't. Alice felt it every hour now, a soft pressure behind her ribs, not pain but presence. Riemann no longer spoke to her directly. She sensed her movements were monitored subtly but constantly. Conversations with colleagues shifted when she approached. Files once available to her disappeared behind permission walls. And yet, nothing overt happened. No sanctions, no isolation, just space, a growing ring of quiet. She could have deactivated the code, deleted S-Delta-1, and returned to procedure. But the notion of erasure felt violent. It wasn't file anymore. It was a promise she hadn't made, but couldn't break. Every part of her, mind, memory, instinct, began to reorder itself around the potential of this being. Not a child. Not yet. Just the possibility of an echo. But what kind of echo would it be? Alice had no romantic notions about perfection. She understood, perhaps more deeply than most, the fragility of emergent systems. Even with ideal coding, even in a controlled environment, there were variables no algorithm could harness. She wasn't trying to make herself again. That was the first myth she had to shatter. The girl, if she came into being, would not be a replica. she would be rupture. Alice spent hours walking the fields, rehearsing arguments she would never say aloud. To Reman, to the Ethics Council, to the city itself. I'm not violating the directive. I'm fulfilling it. Creation is part of sustainability. You taught me that. But the words rang hollow, not because they weren't true, but because the system had no space for truth it didn't authorize. Hesper's stability depended on predictability. Reproduction wasn't banned. It was streamlined, assigned, managed by compatibility analytics, psychometric filters, genetic clearance, and most importantly, timing. No one was allowed to reproduce out of sequence, out of impulse, out of love. So what did that make Alice now? She stood one evening beneath the solar dome as the sky filtered down into indigo. From a distance, the lights flickered like real stars. She had always found the illusion beautiful. Tonight it felt like scaffolding, artificial, rigid, inescapable. A voice interrupted her thoughts. You've changed. Alice turned. The speaker was Cale, another ecologist. They'd worked adjacent for years, but rarely spoke. His eyes were steady, not unkind. In what way? She asked. You used to talk like a system. Now you talk like a story. She didn't answer, unsure if it was a compliment or a warning. I saw your name flagged on the biosequence logs, he added. S-Delta 1. It's not encrypted. Alice felt the chill, but not a fear. Of exposure. Cale's face was unreadable. Are you reporting me? She asked. No. I'm asking you why. Her voice felt strange in her throat. I think I discovered something. About us. About being human. And I can't unknow it. Cale studied her a moment longer. Then he said, Do you think knowing makes you responsible? Alice swallowed. I think not acting would be worse. He nodded, slowly. Then you'll need help. It was the first offer of alliance she had received since the unraveling began. Cale didn't press for details. Didn't ask to see the code. He simply stood beside her under the fall stars until the system dimmed the light, and the dome sank into night. Still, no decision came easily. Alice lay in her pod that night, eyes open, heart racing, her thoughts drifting to the moment of activation. It would be irreversible. Not just a file, not just a shift in role. It would mark her as divergent, perhaps even dangerous. And yet, the girl's image was no longer just an apparition. She had weight now, texture, a name whispered in dream fragments. Luma. Alice hadn't chosen it. It had come to her like a scent or a rhythm. Luma, light born in silence. She went to the incubation chamber 2 days later, an off-grid module used for botanical crossbreeds. The system didn't flag her presence. Cale had seen to that. She brought the encrypted core, wrapped in a neutral carrier shell, and placed it in the central processor. The screen flickered. A quiet pulse emerged. Not sound, but data resonance. Recognition. Then a message. Sequence ready. Initiate formation? Alice hesitated. Fingertips hovering. Would Luma feel pain? Would she dream? Would she want to exist? Another message followed, almost as if the system could read her. Probability of stable development, 94%. Emotional autonomy variable. Alice exhaled. No system could predict what mattered most. She pressed yes. The chamber glowed softly as the code integrated into the synthetic matrix. Nothing dramatic. No heartbeat, no light show. Just a whisper in the circuitry. Something new beginning. Something neither designed nor denied. She stayed until the system confirmed integration, then shut down the outer shell and left the chamber. No alarms. No watchers. Only the hush of possibilities settling into the soil of a tightly controlled world. She walked back to her pod slowly, resisting the urge to run. She didn't know what would happen next. Whether Luma would emerge as a functioning being or be stopped mid-formation by some fail-safe she hadn't seen. Whether the council would discover her, or whether Luma would change everything and make discovery irrelevant. But for the first time in her life, Alice felt something like freedom. Not safety, not peace, but motion. Uncertain electric motion. She reached her door. Just as it opened, she looked up and saw the girl again. Not in glass, not in dream, but in the reflection of her own eyes. smiling. Luma was not born the way the stories once told it. There was no blood, no breathless labor, no cry into the open air. She emerged in silence, the chamber lights blinking soft blue as the matrix completed its work. Tissue fused, neural patterns imprinted, genetic threads unspooled like silk. A life form not in darkness but in design, calculated, precise, and yet unexpectedly wild. Alice watched from behind the observation glass. The containment field shimmered faintly, separating her from the gestation pod that now held what she could no longer call theory. Luma's form was small, curled, and unmistakably human. Her fingers twitched before her eyelids ever fluttered. Her skin, pale, untouched by sun, seemed thinner than paper. Alice pressed her hand to the glass and felt nothing but a deep, impossible ache. Cale stood behind her, silent. He had done what he could, disabled the chamber's broadcast protocols, rerouted surveillance sweeps, falsified logs. But he had limits. They both did. She's stabilizing faster than expected, he said finally. She wants to be here, Alice replied, the words slipping out before she could think. Cale didn't challenge her. Not anymore. But the silence that followed was heavier than gratitude. What will you do if they find out? He asked. Alice didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the tiny, breathing miracle before her. Luma opened her eyes 3 days later. Not gradually. One moment closed, the next open, bright, and aware. She did not cry. She simply looked, first at the chamber ceiling, then slowly, curiously, toward the mirrored observation panel. Alice had not been inside yet. The physical interface was risky. Too many variables. Too many sensors waiting to detect biological mismatch. And yet, the urge to cross that threshold, to hold what she had called forth, was overwhelming. They built a plan. Cale would extend the suppression field for 36 hours. Long enough for Alice to enter, long enough to make contact, and if needed, long enough to disappear. I'm not going to lose her, Alice said. Not now. Then you'll have to lose everything else, Cale replied. The cost was always implied, but saying it aloud made it real. The first time Alice stepped into the chamber, Luma was sitting upright, propped by a support sling designed for muscle training. She turned her head slowly as the door hissed open. Her gaze met Alice's without hesitation, without fear. You came, Luma said. The voice was soft but formed. Language had been encoded, yes, but comprehension wasn't guaranteed. It was as if something older, something beyond sequencing, had carried her from dream into articulation. Alice knelt beside her. Do you know who I am? Luma tilted her head. You're the beginning. Alice blinked hard, refusing to cry. Not here. Not now. Do you feel safe? Luma nodded. Not alone. It wasn't an answer to the question Alice asked, but it was the answer she needed. They spent those 36 hours in quiet communion. Alice read to her from the old texts, fragmented poems and long-erased lullabies. Luma didn't speak much, but when she did, her words echoed with uncanny depth, as if each one had been waiting centuries to be spoken. I dream of trees, she said once, curled against Alice's side. But the leaves are shaped like faces. Are they watching you? They're waiting. Alice didn't know what it meant, but the way Luma spoke, it never felt like nonsense. It felt like truth from a language she hadn't learned yet. On the morning of the third day, the sensor alarms tripped, not in the chamber. Outside, perimeter sweep flagged an anomaly in energy distribution. Cale's suppression field had been detected. They had minutes, maybe less. You have to go. Cale's voice crackled through the comm. Alice turned to Luma. We have to hide. Somewhere safe. But Luma stood still. Her eyes didn't waver. I can't go where you're going, she said. Alice froze. What are you talking about? You have to come with me. Luma's small hand reached out and touched Alice's chest. You made me to continue, not to follow. The words struck harder than any warning klaxon. I didn't make you, Alice whispered. I asked if you wanted to be. And I did, Luma said, but not just to be your echo. Alice felt her breath fracture. She had told herself she wasn't replicating, that Luma was her own, But some part of her, deep hidden, had still longed for familiarity. Now she saw it clearly. Luma wasn't a second self. She was a separate one. Footsteps echoed down the corridor outside. Multiple boots. Not Kale. Alice reached into the emergency locker and pulled out the stasis disc. "I can hide you," she said. "They won't find you. I'll come back." Luma stepped back. "If I hide, I won't grow. There won't be a future if they take you." "There will," she said softly. "But maybe not for you." The door lock unlatched with a sharp hiss. Alice turned, her body blocking Luma from view. 3 enforcers entered, followed by Remen. His face was unreadable. "You've broken code," he said. "You've overridden law." Alice didn't answer. Her hand was still on the stasis disc, but she didn't lift it. "She's alive," she said. "She's unauthorized," Remen replied. "She's alive." Remen stepped forward, eyes hard. "This ends now." But then Luma spoke. "Why are you afraid of me?" The room fell silent. Remen stared. His mouth parted, then closed again. The enforcers didn't move. "I am not dangerous," Luma continued. "But I am different. You were different once, too." No one spoke. No one breathed. Alice turned to her. Luma's voice was small, but it reverberated through the room like thunder. "This is what comes after," she said. "Not to replace you. To evolve you." Remen looked at Alice. For a long moment, there was no command, no condemnation. Just the weight of a decision no algorithm could make. "We will convene the council," he said finally, "and she will be evaluated." Alice didn't speak, didn't resist. She reached for Luma's hand, and Luma took it. They walked out together. Not fugitives, not criminals, but something else, something new. The council chamber was colder than Alice remembered. Built from gleaming alloy and transparency panels, it was designed to feel impartial, neither welcoming nor cruel, but that neutrality only sharpened the tension. Every sound echoed. Every breath felt recorded. Alice sat at the center with Luma beside her, silent, her small fingers tracing slow circles into the metal of the seat. The council members sat in a semicircle beyond the panel divide, faceless behind polarized visors. Protocol dictated it. Objectivity through anonymity. Remen stood before them, not as accuser, but as intermediary. He recited the data calmly. Unauthorized access, unapproved embryo activation, genetic divergence from assigned parameters. He never once raised his voice. He didn't need to. The facts were enough. She was not created for utility, he said. She was created from impulse. Alice didn't speak. Neither did Luma. The lead counselor finally leaned forward. Her voice filtered through the reverb mask. "What do you claim this child is?" Alice met her gaze through the darkened glass. "She is a response." "To what?" the counselor asked. "To what we've become." There was a pause, a long one. The council was not made of zealots. They were stewards of continuity, believers in design. Their fear wasn't chaos. It was the unplanned, that which could not be traced back to authorized code or calculated intent. Luma was neither rogue AI nor natural offspring. She was a hybrid of history and hope, and that made her dangerous. "She speaks," one counselor said. "She demonstrates independent thought." "She was never programmed to obey," Alice replied, "only to learn." Another pause, this one heavier. Luma looked up then, her voice quiet but firm. "May I speak?" The council did not respond immediately. Then, with a silent nod from the lead, the voice filter clicked off. Luma stood. She wasn't tall. Her movements were still unsteady, but her presence filled the space with something neither mechanical nor juvenile, something ancient. "I was not made in the way you approve," she began, "but I am not a mistake." Her words fell like water on stone, gentle but persistent. "I do not want to replace you. I want to understand you." The lead counselor tilted her head. "What do you believe you are?" Luma didn't hesitate. "I am the part of you that still wants to change." The chamber held its breath, and for the first time, no one had a rule prepared. They did not release Alice that day, nor did they decommission Luma. Instead, The council recessed for a multi-phase evaluation. The official phrasing was meant to sound impartial, but Alice understood it for what it was: a stay of execution, delay, in hopes the problem would resolve itself. But Luma did not resolve. She grew, not quickly but unmistakably. Her hair darkened, her speech matured, her questions deepened. She was relocated to a secure facility under interactive study, but it wasn't a cell. Alice was allowed limited access. Kale was reassigned to monitor neuroprogression. They called it containment. Alice knew it was observation. They were watching Luma not for danger, but for revelation. Do you think they'll ever accept her? Kale asked one evening, watching Luma trace shapes in the glass. No, Alice replied. Not all of them, but some might. Kale nodded slowly. She doesn't seem afraid. She isn't. Why not? Because she wasn't born into fear. Luma spent her days not in simulation, but in storytelling. She asked questions no one expected. About history, language, loss. She drew pictures of forests no one had seen, faces she couldn't have known. She said strange things at times, cryptic, poetic. I think in spirals, she said once. Not lines. But slowly, others began to listen. A technician wrote a report calling her a unique cognitive architecture, nonlinear, emotionally resonant. Another called her an emergent consciousness. But what struck Alice most wasn't the metrics. It was the way Luma affected the people around her. They stopped referring to her as a project. They started calling her by name. Alice watched all this with fragile mixture of awe and dread. Luma was growing beyond her, not just biologically, but symbolically. She was no longer a question. She was becoming an answer, one the system hadn't prepared for. One night, during an unsupervised hour, Luma asked Alice a question she hadn't dared expect. Do you regret it? Alice took a long breath. Bringing you into this world? Yes. Alice shook her head. I regret waiting so long. Luma was quiet. Then, I see pieces of you when I dream. What do you mean? Not your face, but the choices you didn't make. They live somewhere. Alice felt something splinter in her chest. Do you ever wish you were someone else? She asked. Luma smiled. No, but I do wish more people chose to begin like you did. It was then Alice understood. Luma didn't need permission to exist. She needed purpose, and that purpose was unfolding, person by person, in the silent cracks of a system built on stasis. The council met again weeks later, not to decide Luma's fate, but to redefine the protocols around synthetic life. It was unprecedented, uneasy, but inevitable. She has introduced instability, one member said. She has introduced potential, another replied. Neither was wrong. Alice was never reinstated. Her clearance remained suspended. Her record would never be cleared, but she was not removed. She was simply watched, studied, remembered. And Luma? She walked freely now, not just in Hesper's restricted corridors, but into the public zones, into the domes, into the fields. She smiled at passers-by, asked strangers impossible questions. Some turned away, others answered. One day, she disappeared. No trace, no sensor trail, no breach, just absence. The official report called it a system anomaly, but Alice didn't believe it. She believed Luma had gone where systems didn't reach, where spirals replaced lines, where beginning wasn't bound by blueprint. Sometimes, when she walks the fields, Alice hears a laugh in the wind, a whisper in the air vents, a flicker in reflective glass. She asks herself the same question, again and again. Did she really try to reproduce herself? No. She tried to listen to the part of her that had been silenced, and what she created wasn't a mirror. It was a doorway,